Love you, sweetheart. Oh, I just love that song. I love it when Casey does it too. I think the children are being dismissed now. I love that song because the writer draws a very clear contrast or distinction between the names that he attaches to himself and then ultimately the name that God gives to him. I mean, think about this. He says, I am a flower quickly fading. I am here today and gone tomorrow. It's almost as if he's saying, my name is a wave tossed in the ocean. My name is a vapor in the wind. That's how he's looking at himself. But then he listens to another voice, and that's the voice of God. And he says, God, you've told me who I am, and I am yours. My name is yours. Someone of God's own possession, someone of infinite worth, someone of infinite value. My name is simply yours. Now, sometimes the names that we associate with ourselves are good, and we think of ourselves in a positive light, but sometimes the names that we associate with ourselves are not so good. But how does God see us? I mean, what kind of names does God ascribe to us in His Word, and how can that make a difference in our lives? Well, first we have to understand that there is a lot of power in the name, isn't there? And to kind of illustrate that, I'd like to just read for you a couple of names of people that you probably have heard of. You don't need to respond in any way or raise your hand. Just kind of think about what these names mean to you, okay? Here we go. How about this one? Abraham Lincoln. How about Bill Clinton? How about Mother Teresa? Pretty popular. Saddam Hussein. Jesus. How about Adolf Hitler? These names kind of invoke some emotion and some thoughts and maybe even rage, maybe joy. Well, I need you to help me out. There's one more name I'd like to look at today, but you have to help me out. I'm going to count to 3, and I'd like all of us to say our first and last name out loud, okay? Can we do that? 1, 2, 3. Kent Gerhart. I don't know, a little bit louder. Here we go. You really got to hear it. 1, 2, 3. Kent Gerhart. All right. Now, what kinds of thoughts or feelings or emotions come to mind when you contemplate your name? You know, are they good? Are they bad? Is it sort of indifferent? Well, I think that most of us go through at least some period in our life where we kind of see ourselves in a little bit of a negative light. Now, it might not be everything about ourselves, but it might be, one small thing, something that we see as wrong or inferior or demeaning in some way. We might even call ourselves a name like stupid or dumb or boy, that was dumb, why did I do that? Or we beat up on ourselves for things that might even be totally out of our control. Even spiritual giants do this. I mean, think about Moses. If we look in the Bible, if we go to Exodus, you remember the story where God appears to Moses in the burning bush. And this is what God says to Moses in Exodus 3. He says, now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now in the verses that follow that, a really interesting dialogue starts to take place. I mean, think about this. God just called Moses deliverer. That's the name he gave to Moses. But Moses, he questions God and says, who am I? I can't do this. And then a little bit later, God calls Moses ambassador. He says, you're going to be my ambassador to Egypt. And Moses says, well, what if Pharaoh doesn't listen to me? Starts making excuses. And then God calls Moses spokesman. He says, you're going to be my spokesman for the entire nation of Israel, for all the leaders of Israel. You're going to be my spokesman. And Moses says, whoa, that's not me. I don't do well in front of crowds. I'm a little slow of speech. I get tongue-tied. That's not me. Send somebody else. So God is trying to convince Moses of who he is. And he says, look, you're a deliverer. You're an ambassador. You're a spokesman. But Moses just can't see it. And it's probably because Moses has other conceptions of himself in his mind. I mean, think about it. 40 years earlier, he was a murderer. He murdered an Egyptian. He ran away from the law, so now he's an outlaw. He's an outcast. He's a common shepherder now. I mean, he's a shepherd. So he's got all these things running through his mind. Now, where do these thoughts come to us from? Well, I think they come to us from a few places. First of all, and I think in an overall sense, they come to us from our enemy, the devil. And the Bible teaches us that in 1 Peter 5:8. He says, "Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." Now, God wants us to be maturing in our faith. He wants us to be growing. He wants us to be reaching out and making other believers, making new disciples. That's what God wants us to be doing. But Satan is right there to seek to kill us and destroy us and to drag us down. He doesn't want us to fulfill God's purpose for his life. So I think at the very core, our enemy, Satan, brings these kinds of thoughts into our mind. Now, secondly, I think names are given to us by other people. Other people. Now, this is huge. I think this is really big because I think a lot of us, we kind of care what other people think about us. There's not too many of us who just don't care at all. I think we do care. There's countless stories of people who've been scarred, sometimes even for life, by harsh words, by names, by things that, people have put on us. How many of us know or have read stories about, young children who were called things even by parents or by teachers or other adults? They're called things like dumb or stupid or you're never going to amount to anything. Perhaps maybe some of you here today even experienced that. And there was this little saying, maybe we've probably all heard this when we were growing up as kids, where we said, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Okay, we've all said that. But that's just not true. We'd like to think it is, but the fact is what other people say to us can be devastating. I have a little quote for you here. It's from William James. He's sometimes known as the father of psychology, and he said this. He said, "There is nothing so absurd that if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it." People will believe it. And that's true of us too. When we repeat and when we dwell on and when we think on the names that people put on us, we begin to believe them. And these names then begin to kind of shape and mold and change us into something that God really never intended for us to be. Now, this can happen to adults too. We're not just talking about little kids who are getting called names in the playground. Okay, this can happen to us as adults too. For example, for many years, probably 20, 30 years, I don't know, I have been involved in leading worship and playing guitar and singing and things like that. There wasn't a church service or a Bible study or a home group or anything that if music and worship and song was needed, I would be right there willing to do it until about 2.5 years ago. I was having a conversation with somebody one day. We were talking about worship and, things like that. And this person looked at me across the table, looked right in my eyes and said, "Kent, when you're at your absolute very best, you are just barely cutting it." When you're at your absolute very best, you're just barely cutting it. And you know what? The next thing I knew is the name I started associating with myself was not worship leader, but worship loser. Okay? That was the name that I started calling myself in my head. And ultimately, I put my guitar down, and instead of playing, a couple times a week at various functions, I only played a couple times a year for the last couple years because I just see myself as worship loser. That became the name that I associated with myself. So it can happen to adults too. Now the sad thing is, the acceptance of this new name on myself, it really had very little to do with what that person said to me. But it had everything to do with my believing it. It had everything to do with my thinking on it. It had everything to do with my listening to it. It had everything to do with my meditating on it. That's really what it had to do with. So people sometimes put names on us. Now we often put names on ourselves too. Sometimes we just kind of make them up ourselves. Think about this. We make mistakes in parenting, so now we start calling ourselves a lousy parent. I've done that. We make mistakes in business. and we go from thinking of ourselves as, a business tycoon, to something else, maybe a business buffoon, all right? Or we make mistakes in relationships, we make mistakes in finances, we make mistakes in our spiritual disciplines, and suddenly we start thinking of ourselves as doomed, or we despair, or we're unworthy, or we're no good. So we start to put these names on ourselves, and eventually we start to become who we say that we are. It happens all the time. Now, it goes the other way, too. Sometimes we can get kind of puffed up and proud and arrogant. We listen to the praises and the compliments that other people give to us, and we start to really believe them and think we're something pretty special. Well, there's a verse in Galatians that kind of warns us about this. Galatians 6:3. It says, if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. So we need to be careful of that. Has anybody here ever watched the movie? It's an animated movie, actually, a cartoon called Toy Story. Anybody ever watch that? Wow, like all the adults here have seen Toy Story. You guys rock. It's a great movie. I love the first one, the very first one. It starred this guy. His name is Buzz Lightyear. He's some sort of a astronaut, space ranger, action hero kind of guy, or at least he thinks he is. And he thinks he's got superpowers. He thinks he can fly. He thinks he's got like laser beams in his wrists and all this stuff. Now, he's got a friend, Woody, who's trying to convince them that he's really not that. In fact, Woody says, look, all this stuff written on the box that you think you are, that's really not who you are. So one day Buzz tries to prove it. He gets up to this really tall height and he says, I want to fly. So he jumps off, and sure enough, he crashes and fails and breaks his arm and just fails abysmally. He was not who he thought he was. Well, you know what? That can happen to us. We get kind of puffed up. We get kind of thinking all these great things about ourselves unjustly. We're flying high, and then all of a sudden, we start to crash and burn. The Lord even allows that. He allows things to come into our life that kind of show us who we are and get us back on track. So we need to be wary of that too.